Pastor Marcus Whitfield's voice carried across the autumn evening as he raised his weathered Bible toward the stone steps of St. Catherine's Catholic Church. His congregation of 37 faithful followers pressed closer, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of handheld candles. Brothers and sisters, we stand before a house that has forgotten the true gospel, Marcus declared, his gray eyes fixed on the ornate wooden doors. They worship graven images instead of the living Christ. Rebecca Whitfield touched her husband's arm gently. Marcus, perhaps we should— No. His voice hardened as memories of his sister, Sarah, flooded back. 3 years ago, she had walked through those very doors and abandoned everything their family believed. The cancer took her 6 months later, but not before she had chosen their rituals over his prayers. The evening service bells began to chime from within St. Catherine's, and Marcus felt the familiar fire rise in his chest. Tonight, someone needed to speak truth to this deception. Marcus pushed through the heavy oak doors as the Catholic congregation rose for evening prayer. The scent of incense struck him like a physical blow, reminding him of Sarah's funeral. Father Miguel looked up from the altar, his kind eyes widening in surprise. Pastor Whitfield, you're welcome to join us, but Marcus strode down the center aisle, his footsteps echoing against the vaulted ceiling. Elderly parishioners clutched their rosaries tighter. Children peered from behind their mothers' skirts. The Virgin Mary statue stood in the corner alcove, draped in blue silk, surrounded by flickering votive candles. "This is what killed my sister," Marcus shouted, pointing at the serene marble face. "This idol worship, this false hope." Without hesitation, he spat directly onto the statue's carved cheek. The saliva glistened against the white stone as gasps filled the sacred space. Marcus opened his mouth to continue his tirade, but no sound emerged. He tried again, pressing his hand to his throat. Nothing. Complete, absolute silence where his voice had been just seconds before. Terror replaced rage as he realized something impossible had just occurred. Dr. Harrison adjusted his stethoscope and frowned at the examination results. "Your vocal cords appear perfectly healthy, Pastor Whitfield. There's no swelling, no damage, no infection." Marcus touched his throat frantically, mouthing words that refused to form sound. Rebecca squeezed his hand as they sat in the sterile examination room 3 days after the incident at St. Catherine's. "We can refer you to a specialist at the University Hospital," Dr. Harrison continued, "but I've never seen anything like this. Complete voice loss with no physical cause." Outside the medical building, Rebecca finally voiced what they both feared. "Marcus, what if this is connected to what happened at the church?" He shook his head violently, pulling out his phone to type. "It's coincidence. Stress-related." But even as he typed the words, doubt gnawed at him. His congregation had already begun whispering. Sunday morning had been devastating, watching Rebecca attempt to deliver his sermon while he stood helplessly beside the pulpit. The collection plate came back lighter than it had been in years. Word was spreading through town about the Protestant pastor who had lost his voice after desecrating Catholic property. The specialists at University Medical Center ran every test imaginable. MRI scans revealed perfectly healthy brain tissue. CT scans showed no abnormalities in his throat or larynx. Blood work came back normal. Even the neurologist, Dr. Patricia Chun, seemed baffled as she reviewed the results. "Pastor Whitfield, medically speaking, there's absolutely no reason you shouldn't be able to speak," she explained, tapping her pen against the thick folder of test results. "Your vocal cords are intact, your nervous system is functioning normally, and there's no evidence of trauma or disease." Marcus wrote furiously on his notepad. "Then why can't I speak?" Dr. Chin studied his desperate handwriting. Sometimes severe psychological trauma can manifest as physical symptoms, but even then, we typically see some physiological markers. Rebecca leaned forward. "What about the timing? It happened so suddenly." The doctor hesitated. "I've practiced medicine for 23 years, and I've never encountered anything quite like this. From a medical standpoint, your husband should be able to speak normally." That evening, Marcus stared at himself in the bathroom mirror, watching his mouth form silent words that carried no sound. The Sunday morning pews at Cornerstone Baptist Church sat half empty. Marcus watched from the pulpit as families who had attended for years found excuses to worship elsewhere. The Hendersons, the Millers, even the Johnsons had quietly slipped away over the past 2 weeks. Board member Thomas Fletcher approached after another awkward service where Rebecca had stumbled through Marcus's hastily written sermon notes. "Pastor, we need to discuss the situation," Thomas said, avoiding eye contact. "The congregation is asking questions we can't answer." Marcus furiously scribbled on his notepad. "This is temporary. Medical issue." Thomas read the words and sighed. "Marcus, people are saying this happened because of what you did at the Catholic Church. They're calling it divine judgment." Rebecca stepped between them. "That's enough, Thomas. Marcus is going through a difficult time." "Rebecca, I respect you both, but donations are down 60%. Without his voice, how can Marcus lead our church?" Thomas's words hung heavy in the sanctuary air. That night, Rebecca found Marcus sitting alone in his study, staring at the family photo where Sarah smiled beside him at last year's church picnic, just months before her conversion tore their relationship apart. The official letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, bearing the church board's letterhead. Marcus's hands trembled as he read the formal language requesting his temporary leave of absence until this medical situation resolves. They had given him 30 days to regain his voice or face permanent removal from his position. Rebecca found him crumpled in his study chair, the letter fallen to the floor. "They can't do this to you," she whispered, but they both knew the board had every right. Their savings account dwindled rapidly. The church provided housing, utilities, and Marcus's salary. Without his position, they faced losing everything. Marcus spent hours each night in desperate attempts to force sound from his throat, pressing his hands against his neck, straining until veins bulged on his forehead. Nothing. The silence had become a prison, trapping him inside his own body. He wrote frantic prayers on scraps of paper, begging God to restore what he had lost, but the pages remained as voiceless as he was. On the 23rd day of his affliction, Marcus stood before his bathroom mirror at 3 a.m, mouth opening and closing like a dying fish, and finally understood the depth of his helplessness. The doorbell chimed just as Rebecca was clearing lunch dishes. Through the window, she saw Father Miguel standing on their porch, accompanied by 3 elderly women from St. Catherine's Parish. Marcus retreated to his study, but Rebecca opened the door. "Father Miguel, I wasn't expecting you." The priest's weathered face showed genuine concern. "Mrs. Whitfield, we've come to check on your husband. The whole parish has been praying for his recovery." One of the women, Mrs. Rodriguez, stepped forward holding a covered casserole dish. "We brought dinner. No one should suffer alone." Marcus emerged reluctantly from the hallway, suspicious and embarrassed. Father Miguel approached with open hands. "Pastor Whitfield, we harbor no anger toward you. We understand grief can drive us to actions we later regret." The priest's words hit Marcus unexpectedly. These were the people he had attacked, whose sacred space he had violated, and yet they stood on his doorstep offering comfort rather than condemnation. Mrs. Rodriguez nodded knowingly. "I lost my son to cancer last year. Anger makes us do terrible things sometimes." For the first time since losing his voice, Marcus felt tears threatening to break free. Word spread quietly through both congregations about a prayer vigil for Pastor Whitfield. Rebecca discovered the gathering when she drove past St. Catherine's that Friday evening and saw candlelight flickering in the parking lot. Catholics and Protestants stood together in a loose circle, their voices rising in harmonious hymns that transcended denominational boundaries. Mrs. Henderson from Marcus's own church stood beside Maria Santos from the Catholic parish, both women clutching worn prayer books. Rebecca parked and walked over to Father Miguel. "I had no idea people were doing this. Faith calls us to care for one another, especially those who are suffering," he replied gently. "Your husband's pain is real, regardless of how it began." When Rebecca returned home, she found Marcus staring out the window toward the distant church spire. "There are people praying for you right now," she said softly. Catholics and Protestants together. Marcus wrote quickly. Why would they do that after what I did? Rebecca studied his desperate handwriting. Maybe because they understand forgiveness better than we thought. That night, Marcus couldn't sleep. The image of his enemies praying for his healing challenged everything he believed about the divisions between their faiths. The walk to St. Catherine's felt like the longest journey of Marcus's life. Rebecca held his trembling hand as they approached the ornate doors he had stormed through 4 weeks earlier. Evening Mass had ended, but several parishioners lingered in the pews, their quiet prayers echoing softly in the candlelit sanctuary. Father Miguel looked up from the altar with surprise and gentle welcome. Pastor Whitfield, Rebecca, please come in. Marcus's legs felt unsteady as he walked down the center aisle toward the Virgin Mary statue. The marble figure stood exactly as before, serene and beautiful, the blue silk drape flowing gracefully around her carved form. Someone had placed fresh white lilies at her feet. The dozen witnesses fell silent as Marcus approached the alcove. Mrs. Rodriguez clutched her rosary. Thomas Fletcher, who had somehow learned of Marcus's visit, stood near the back with several other Protestant neighbors. Marcus knelt slowly before the statue, his knees hitting the cold stone floor with audible impact. For the first time in 4 weeks, he wasn't thinking about his voice, his pride, or his position. He was thinking about Sarah, about forgiveness, and about the hatred that had consumed him since her conversion. The sanctuary held its breath. Marcus pressed his palms together and closed his eyes, feeling the weight of 4 weeks of silence and 20 years of misplaced anger. In the holy stillness, he finally understood that his rage had never been about theology. It had been about losing Sarah, about feeling abandoned when she chose a different path to God. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the statue, and the words came out clearly, audibly, miraculously. The sanctuary erupted in gasps and crying. Rebecca fell to her knees beside him, tears streaming down her face. Father Miguel crossed himself, his eyes wide with wonder. Mrs. Rodriguez began praying the rosary aloud in Spanish, while Thomas Fletcher stood frozen in the back pew. Marcus touched his throat in amazement, feeling the vibration of his restored voice. "I'm sorry for what I did to your sacred space," he continued, his words growing stronger. "I'm sorry for the hatred I carried in my heart." He turned to face the gathered witnesses, Catholics and Protestants alike. "I blamed you for taking my sister from me, but Sarah found her own way to Christ. I should have celebrated her faith instead of condemning it." Dr. Chin would later document the medical impossibility of instantaneous vocal cord restoration, but everyone present knew they had witnessed something beyond science. The following Sunday, Marcus stood before both congregations in the neutral space of the community center. Catholics from St. Catherine's sat alongside Protestants from Cornerstone Baptist, many hearing his restored voice for the first time since the miracle. "I owe you all a deeper explanation," Marcus began, his voice steady but humble. "When my sister Sarah converted to Catholicism 3 years ago, I felt like I had failed her as a brother and as a pastor. When cancer took her 6 months later, I convinced myself that her new faith had somehow betrayed her." Mrs. Rodriguez nodded knowingly from the front row. Father Miguel sat beside Thomas Fletcher, both men listening intently. "But Sarah didn't abandon Christ when she joined your parish," Marcus continued, looking directly at the Catholic families. "She found him in a different way, and instead of celebrating that miracle, I let grief turn into hatred." He pulled out a worn letter from his pocket. "Sarah wrote this before she died. She said she prayed every day that I would learn to see Christ in all his children, regardless of denomination." Rebecca wiped tears as Marcus read Sarah's words aloud, her gentle voice bridging the divide that had separated these communities for decades. 6 months later, the monthly joint prayer service had become the most anticipated gathering in town. Marcus stood at the podium in St. Catherine's Sanctuary, the very space where his voice had been taken and restored, addressing the packed pews filled with both Catholic and Protestant families. "Sarah always believed that faith should unite us rather than divide us," he said, his voice carrying the warmth that had made him beloved before pride consumed him. She would be amazed to see what God has done through our two congregations. The community garden project had flourished behind the church, tended by hands from both parishes. The interfaith food pantry served families regardless of denomination. Children who had once been taught to mistrust each other now played together during the joint youth programs. Father Miguel approached the podium as Marcus concluded. "We serve the same Christ," the priest said simply. "That has always been true, but now we live it." As the congregations joined hands for the closing prayer, Marcus caught sight of the Virgin Mary statue in her alcove, surrounded by fresh flowers from both Catholic and Protestant gardens. Her marble face seemed to smile with the same peace that had settled over his heart. Have you ever witnessed something that science couldn't explain? Share your story in the comments below, and let us know if you've experienced moments where the impossible became possible.